Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into a fascinating and honestly a deeply provocative piece of philosophical writing. We're going to impartially unpack a source text that argues something pretty radical. It claims that our everyday, seemingly normal urge to control other people is actually a severe offense. So let's break down exactly how the author constructs this argument, step by step, taking a completely neutral look at their very unique perspective on human autonomy. Okay, let's dive right into this radical premise. The text really doesn't mince words here. It immediately establishes a stark binary. If you attempt to control another normal person, you are either committing a crime or you're suffering from a psychological disorder. There's no middle ground. It's a massive reframing of standard human behavior, so let's see exactly how they justify this intense claim. That brings us to our first concept, the rule of control. To really understand this philosophy, we first need to look at who is actually meant to be controlled. The text establishes a super strict boundary. On one side, we have the only entities that should be controlled: livestock, individuals with severe mental impairments, referred to in the text as idiots and maniacs, and criminals. On the other side, we have strictly designated controllers: agricultural staff, medical professionals, and prison guards. Control is entirely reserved for these specific institutions managing specific populations. Outside of this dynamic, the author says control has absolutely no place. Right, so what happens when we try to apply control outside of those special organizations? Well, the text draws a pretty harsh comparison. Normal relations are defined as equal, friendly, and mutually respecting. But the moment you introduce control, the dynamic shifts entirely. Treating an equal like they need to be managed equates to viewing them as an animal, a slave, or a prisoner. You're essentially appointing yourself as a slave master or a jailer. Moving along, let's look at what we can call the radical diagnosis. Because if controlling a peer makes you a jailer in your own mind, the author believes there are severe real-world implications for your character. The act of controlling another normal person actively despises human rights and tramples on human dignity. Because of this severe violation of autonomy, the text concludes that the controller is effectively committing a crime or exhibiting symptoms of a mental disorder. The logic here is that only a criminal or someone who is unwell would willingly strip a peer of their basic dignity. And that leads us right into our next point: everyday criminals. Now, here's where it gets really fascinating. The source takes this intense institutional logic and applies it directly to the home. Take marriage, for example. The author outlines 6 specific arenas where couples try to control each other: economy, emotion, body, thought, spirit, and soul. Because these traces of mutual control are so unbelievably common, the source makes the sweeping claim that the vast majority of husbands and wives are, in essence, criminals or mental patients. Through the lens of this philosophy, the everyday compromises of marriage are actually severe violations of freedom. This impartial judgment scales across family generations, too. Parents who continue to exercise control over their grown children are firmly diagnosed as criminals. But get this, it takes an even harsher stance on the reverse. If a child attempts to control their parent, they are categorized as not just criminals, but also as mental patients. The source sees the specific inversion of the natural family dynamic as a crystal clear indicator of psychological disorder. Let's expand this a bit further. Up next, lovers and the workplace. So this strict categorization extends far beyond just the family unit. You know the intense mutual control you sometimes see with infatuated lovers? Well, the text asserts that actually shows traces of mental disorders. In the workplace, the text does concede that higher authorities controlling lower authorities in an organization is perfectly normal. However, if a boss personally controls a subordinate, blurring the line between professional authority and personal dominance, this creates an abnormal, archaic master and slave dynamic. Which brings us to the philosophical root of the argument: the deprivation of freedom. So why exactly does the author view all these totally common everyday interactions so severely? It all boils down to the absolute deprivation of fundamental freedom. The source insists on a very clear dividing line here. Animals, patients during their illness, and prisoners serving their time are rightfully deprived of freedom, but a normal person is endowed with complete freedom as guaranteed by the Constitution. The author's argument rests entirely on this strict separation. You simply cannot treat a free person with the methods reserved for a prisoner. And to really drive this point home, the author poses a very pointed rhetorical question right to the reader. Aren't we criminals if we deprive a normal person of his freedom? It's designed to challenge your perspective on how you unknowingly treat those closest to you. If you accept their premise that controlling equals depriving freedom, well, the logic forces you to confront your own behavior and your personal relationships. Finally, let's look at the ultimate goal of this philosophy, the Life Shin vision. You might be wondering, where is this absolute freedom meant to be perfectly applied? The text outlines a specific utopian vision, introducing a unique group of people referred to as Chanyan celestials. For these individuals, the rejection of control isn't just a suggestion, it is a strict mandate. Chanyan celestials are explicitly instructed that they must never attempt to control anyone, and they must fully and absolutely respect the freedom of others at all times. This strict adherence to absolute autonomy forms a core pillar of what the source calls holographic management. This is an operational principle meant to be practiced within a specific community structure the text refers to as the home without marriage and family of life Chanwan. In this idealized space, the control of man by man is completely and strictly prohibited, ensuring that the theoretical freedom we've been discussing becomes a lived reality. And that brings us to the end of our breakdown today. The source leaves us with one final, incredibly provocative warning regarding the dynamics of our own relationships. It asks, when we try to control others, are we heading for crimes or schizophrenia? Whether you agree with the author's radical definitions or find them entirely extreme, it certainly forces a deep reflection on how we balance care, influence, and autonomy in our everyday lives. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I hope it helped illuminate this completely fascinating philosophical perspective.